I'm Rabbi Patrick, and welcome to Kihila. I hope we're all having a lot of fun together because I know I am. So this is episode 3, Thoughts on Suffering. Woof, heavy stuff. So I want to thank Penn Markham for suggesting this topic. And you can suggest a topic too. Just send me an email and I'll noodle on it a little bit and I'll see what I got here in Rabbi Land. And I'll put something together and we'll put it up because this is your thing, not my thing. I want to dedicate this to my pal Justin Curfman of the rock band Feeding Fingers and his family, his growing family in Napoli, Italy, because I'm going to mention Justin a little bit in this podcast, so he is deserving of that. If you have people that you'd like mentioned in the podcast, again, you can just reach out to me. Like I'm an easy guy to work with. So we're going to set our kavanot by reading a little bit of Bereshit. This is the book of Genesis. This is the first book and the first parsha, the first portion found in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to read a little bit for you. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. Ha'aretz hayata tohu v'vohu v'choshech al pnei tehom v'ruach Elohim merakefet al pnei hamayim. Vayomer Elohim yehi or v'yehi or. Vayar Elohim et haor kitov. Vayavdil Elohim bein haor uvein hachoshech. Vayikra Elohim loor yom lechoshech kara laila. Vayhi erev vayhi vocher yom echad. So what does that mean? Depending on how you want to translate it. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a first day. And so you could actually translate that in a lot of different ways. So Bereshit bara Elohim is like when God began to create. Some people will translate it as in the beginning God created. And this is kind of a weird thing because actually the way that it almost reads like there was something before there was nothing. Like God was just taking the stuff that was there and looked around and said, let's make something. And that's a little different than what some scholars think. They think the universe comes together ex nihilo, from nothing. But it looks like there's a something. There's some stuff that kind of like happened, like maybe there's a prequel to the story. And that's where Kabbalah comes in, Jewish mysticism. So the earth, the eretz, the land, the aretz, is tohu vavohu. It's unformed and void. You could also say it's like welter and waste, like it's not being used properly. Okay? And there's this idea of like a wind from God, but this is actually the Ruach Elohim. This is like the spirit of God sweeps over the water. So you'll find that Ruach is sometimes used for something very spiritual, like spirit. It's also the word wind sometimes. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. So in other words, things come to the universe through language, which is a powerful idea. God sees the light and judges it. So it's almost as though God doesn't know exactly what this thing is going to be yet, but God is bringing things into being, ordering things, putting things where they belong, and then placing judgment on that belonging. And that's how you get the first day. And some people will say day one or one day, whatever you want to call, vayhi erev, vayhi vocher. So there was evening and there was morning, yom echad, like day one day, however you want to play that one out. So the beginning, or a beginning, at some point there's a particular beginning. And it seems like we go from nothing to something, or maybe something of some kind goes to something better through organization. This is a theme in art. The way that the poet who wrote this part of Genesis, this is a person who is coming out of exile. This is someone who has a Babylonian Jewish mindset. And they're thinking about this creation of the universe in terms of the creative. So at the time, the prevailing belief about how the universe came together was war. It was violence. It was one god killing another, and then the body of that god being the fertile land within which the earth exists. Tiamat, who is a deity of that place and of that time, was cut in half. And so you think of almost like a clam shell. Like one half of the clam is the earth and the other half of the clam is the sky. There's other ideas found in Egyptian mythology about how the death and resurrection of beings leads to the existence of our world. And this is a different thing. This is saying that actually the universe is created, and it's created with creativity in mind. So let's continue with the theme of art, and I'm going to talk about my pal Justin and his basement. So there was a period of time in my life where I lived with Justin, and it was super cool. I think back very fondly on those times because it was sort of like living in Andy Warhol's factory. For some of you creative types, maybe you know what I'm talking about. So it's this house in a sort of working class suburb of Atlanta. And, he owned the house, and then I lived in it. I was his roommate, and we had this basement. And in the basement, it was like a media lab. So he did stop motion surrealist animation at the time, and he had his studio there. And then he had an actual sort of music studio that he had built, and he had like a vocal room. So you go in this room, and there's glass that separates the producer from the artist, and he could sit at his computer and he could listen, and he could, sort of watch the vocalist, and, he would speak through a microphone, and you could hear through the speaker in the other room. And then there were always things set up. There were always like guitars, drum kits, like lots of pieces of drum kits just always laying around. And of course, amplifiers and cables and mics and all of that just always around. There was always just this creativity. And if you lived in this house, or if you were one of the people who was lucky enough to practice there, record there, whatever, there's actually an intense amount of suffering. Because I'm not in the music world anymore, but creativity really is very painful. You have all of these different things, whether it's, the stop motion animation figures, like these little tiny figures. I would see him, you take one photo of a figure, then he would barely move it, and then you take another photo of the figure, then he'd barely move it. All of that would then go into a computer, and he would sort of glue all of these photos together to make 1 second of a surrealist stop-motion animation film. And, he would do this for hours and hours and hours, or I would be in the studio with my band practicing and just be hours and hours and hours, or he would be working on an album for his band, Feeding Fingers, and it would just be hours and hours and hours. And there's something that's very joyful about that. There's something joyful about you're sitting on the floor, with a notepad, spiral-bound notepad, and you're writing lyrics. That was sort of my job. And you're seeing other artists are working with, in my case, Josh Lamar, Mary Collins, great musicians in Atlanta. And, you'd see how you would spend so much time just trying to get the tone of a guitar correct, or you would spend all of your time just clicking at a computer just to get that little drum sound, like that perfect, like how do you get the snare drum on a drum set that maybe has like 9 other drums on it? Like, if you're like in a metal band, let's say you have these like huge drum kits, right? Or if you're in a jazz band, you have these huge drum kits, and you have like all these different kinds of drums, but here you are just trying to get the snare drum correct, or the floor tom. So there, to your right, there would be something called a floor tom, and it would be this it's this like gigantic drum. It's not as big as the kick drum, the thing that's right in the front. It's this other, this other drum. I can't remember actually if it's the right or the left. I actually think it's to the left. I'm not a drummer, but you have the floor tom there. Yeah, I guess to your left. And I would just hear boom, boom, boom for like 20 minutes straight to finally get the right version of boom. so that then you can have the right version of the sort of lower end of the kit. And then you'd hear the snare tap, 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 tap. And it's like you take the key, the snare key, which tightens the tap, and you can also loosen the tap. And it's just tap, tap, tap over and over and over again just to get that perfect sound. And you've done all that work and it's been like 45 minutes. Now you can finally see if the drum kit sounds right enough to then play a song, right? I mean, it's just bananas. Like even if you were doing music like I did, which wasn't necessarily the most technically proficient stuff, right? It was garage rock, it was dark rock and roll. No real electronics of any kind, occasionally a keyboard, but like you just plug it in and push a button, like not really rocket science, but like in order to do something that primitive, you have to work so technically to just get it exactly how you want it, how you can present it. And there's a suffering, right, where you're just sitting there and you're like, God, how many more times do I have to hear the hi-hat? How many more times are we going to work on the tone of the bass on this one song? And so this kind of suffering is part of a process of becoming. So during all this work, you're setting up, the set of a film, or you're working on making the sound of guitar, bass, drums, keyboards sound right, or anything else that you're working on, whatever your process is. So maybe you're a writer, maybe you love to bake. Maybe you don't think of yourself as creative, but actually kind of is, right? Like maybe you run a business and you're sitting there and you're like, God, how are we going to get through the fourth quarter, right? How do we change the product? How do we change the service so people like it? Or maybe you do something like teaching, or you're a parent. And so you're trying to figure out, well, like, how am I going to get these kids through this class? How am I going to get my kid a job, right? How am I going to get the scholarship for my child so that then they can go to the program where they're going to learn the whatever, right? And there's just this constant low-grade suffering to all things that are creative. Now, the beautiful thing is you love what you're doing. At least I hope you are. And so even though you're suffering, there's kind of a weird joy to it, right? Like you put yourself through it. I remember when I was young, my mom told me, like, why do you want to make your life so hard? Because I was sort of like into entrepreneurship, and I was interested in like the food and beverage business, which doesn't make a lot of money. It's actually notoriously a very difficult line of work to be in, physically and emotionally and financially. You spend a lot of money to make basically no money. I was into music, and that's like, you should do anything in the world except be in a band. I liked art. You should do anything in the world except be an artist. But anyway, yeah. So, but you love it, right? Your kids drive you nuts, but you love them, right? Caring for that aging parent, they drive you nuts, but you love them. And there's this creative act all the time of evaluation and wondering, like, how can I make that next step better? And there's always organizing, right? So it's, like I said, it's not just about, the drums, right? And putting them together. It's the sound of the drums and where are they placed and where do you place the microphone so that you get it just right. In painting, right? How do you get the right color of blue, and how much time is spent with a palette knife just scraping and mixing just on the palette until you get exactly that right color of blue to paint the sky. And you love it, and you're willing to put up with the low-grade suffering that takes place. And that's where, unfortunately, we get into the nature of the universe we live in. God made an amoral universe, and that is that. When the shooting happens, the bullet isn't making a judgment about whether the person is guilty or innocent. When the overdose happens, the drug isn't deciding if this person should live or die. When the bad guy wins the lottery, right? When one business puts another business out of business, when the money is stolen, when the relationship breaks up, all of these things, these are things that are amoral. They go beyond the morality. Especially when you're dealing with what we call natural suffering or natural evil, it's sometimes called. This is when you get into like deep philosopher land and you get into this idea called theodicy, which is this questioning of a moral God and what appears to be a non-moral universe. These things just don't decide based on moral principles, right? If I go outside to check the mail and I get hit by a car, God forbid, it's not likely because of a sin that I did, right? It's not like I did something to deserve that. And the person who, by the way, would hit me, who's looking at their phone because maybe something's happening and they got to go, right? They got to get somewhere. Maybe it's really urgent. Maybe a baby's about to be born. Maybe they need to hold the hand of a dying loved one. And they just look at their phone because they got to get the directions. And then I get, whacked in the knee. Yeah, like that wasn't really a moral thing now, was it? Right? It's just kind of a thing that happens in this world. God made an amoral universe, so not a universe that's necessarily oriented perfectly towards goodness. Sometimes people don't live happily ever after. Sometimes the losers win and the winners lose. And sometimes good guys do bad things, and sometimes they do good things, and sometimes good people do good things, and sometimes bad people do bad things. We live in a universe that allows for that. We can judge it, certainly. We can say this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. That's fine. It's kind of our job. But nevertheless, the universe allows for that. God made an amoral universe, one that is neither moral nor immoral. And why? I think it's because this is the universe. This is the reality, capital R reality, that allows us to be the most creative. We know that there are consequences for our actions. We know if we take the paintbrush, stick it in paint, and put it on the painting, we're going to get what we get. We know that if we stand for a social justice cause and we do it in a certain kind of way, we are going to get arrested. It's just that simple, right? We live in a predictable universe. If I throw a ball up in the air, it's going to fall down to the ground, right? And if that ball is just a rubber ball that you play with, then good. But that ball could also be an important keepsake of a loved one that now I've broken. But gravity doesn't care. Gravity is neutral to anything that it's involved with. God made an amoral universe because that's the kind of universe where you can be the most creative because you know what the consequences of your actions are. And also you can dream. You can create this parallel reality in your mind where you think about what you would like to have. It's really a cool idea, right? We talk about AI now. We already have AI. It's our imaginations, right? I can put a prompt in my imagination, write a story about a kangaroo, and my brain can come up with that. Like we have ChatGPT in our heads already. We evolved it. It's there for us. We can create all of these different layers of complexity, right? What would happen if we took the Snoopy lamp and we put it in a cocktail bar and we took a photo of it and we posted it on Instagram, which, by the way, I actually do have a Snoopy lamp. And as you know, I have a cocktail bar in my house and I do have an Instagram. So that's a reality, right? That's these different elements in a universe and I can imagine them and I can make them a reality. This is the same as how God in a beginning takes things and makes the useless useful. Tohu vavohu is like welter and waste. It's this pointless stuff, but it is made good, and that's how you get day one, right? So I can take these useless things in our amoral universe, and I can point them towards something. I think it was the last episode I talked about assembly theory. This physicist, Sara Walker, who I've been following a little bit, without getting really wonky about it, she talks about the universe and that the universe sort of has almost a goal. And this goal is to create further layers of complexity. And if you want to look into that, that's your own thing. But if you think about the universe in general, right, it is becoming more and more complex all the time. And what's wonderful about this is that human beings are necessary for this kind of complexity, right? The universe needs us so that we can make Bibles and skyscrapers and all of the amazing things that we as human beings do. And so that's why we're here on some level, right? The universe leans into complexity, it leans into creativity, and it leans into imagination, like us. So suffering is part of life, to quote our Buddhist friends in Asia. Suffering is part of life, but compassion and strength are the antidote. Okay, so suffering is part of life. It's part of an amoral universe that is just abounding in creativity. By the way, one of the first things that you find in the Hebrew Bible, actually, the first mitzvah is to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, make things creative, not just make babies, but like make this world a creative and interesting and beautiful place to live in. The setting for the first story of our Bible is the Garden of Eden. Okay. So thinking about a garden means to be creative. It means to make something out of nothing, to make sure that the plants are all lined up in a certain kind of way, right? It's not just like this jungle with everybody wearing fig leaves in front of their privates. This is like, this is a garden that has, rows of different herbs and vegetables and different kinds of plants, and they're beautiful, and the flowers, right? It reminds me of the Baha'i gardens in Haifa. That's what it would have looked like, something like that, very ordered, very structured, or an English garden, if you've ever seen one of those. Just go online and look these up, right? This isn't just wildflowers everywhere. This is structure, order, beauty, aesthetics, right? We're leaning into that, and suffering is a part of that. But there's this other thing, right? So there's a kind of suffering that comes from creativity, but there's also suffering that just is part of human experience, right? When the bullet that doesn't care hits the person who does, right? When the ball is thrown in the air and it comes crashing down because gravity doesn't care, and it breaks the important memento and it hurts someone's feelings, right? The antidote to an amoral universe like that is compassion and strength, and that requires us, right? It's an amazing thing to think about. There's a woman whose name is Temple Grandin. She was one of the first people to really talk about what it was like to be on the autism spectrum. And she has this quote that, nature is cruel, but we don't have to be. And I would maybe take that wonderful quote and I might sort of do a yes and. I might say something like, the nature of nature is suffering and cruelty, but we as humans don't have to be. And we have a solution, which is compassion, kindness, love, generosity. And that requires us, in order to have a universe that is this creative, complex place filled with suffering, it has to be amoral. But an amoral universe can give birth to very moral beings like us. So in that way, in that sense, actually, we live in a very moral universe, should we be willing to take up the challenge. Suffering is a part of life in an amoral universe, but compassion and strengths are the antidotes, and the antidotes require us. We are them. We are a moral imagination in a cold universe. I believe we take the greatest imagination of all and we make it our own. God's imagination. Can you think of something higher than yourself? Maybe it's not the guy in the sky. I get it. Like, whatever. We all have this caricature of God that we don't believe in. But can you imagine that there is a kind of creation, a creator, or a process of creating? Or maybe it's all three of those things bundled into one. And that wonderful imagination is thinking about you, and thinking about you as a creative being in a creative place who can create, right? Made in God's image, exactly that way, to be creative. Think of how you can use your creative imagination towards compassion, love, goodness, generosity, all of these wonderful resources that we have here on this planet. How can we multiply them? How can we have more of it? How can we be great stewards of this great garden of earth, the same way that Adam was? How can we take this cold, amoral universe and make it a reality of joy? I think that that's what it's all about, really. And I think that's something that Kahila does very well. So to wrap all of this up, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. We still have Shavuot coming up, June 1st, 5:30, Art Factory. Love to see you. Talk about creativity, okay? Mount Sinai Mountain of Ice Cream, a little demonstration of the Mount Sinai experience done through ice cream and chocolate and whipped cream and sprinkles. That's pretty fun. And God's in the story, so much the better. We're going to have a little bit of music. We're going to have Jewish books for kids. We want you to take these Jewish books home. They're there for you. It's a gift of love from us here at Kehila. And of course, we'll have some pizza, because if you're going to have ice cream at a party, you have to have pizza. That's the rule. And we'll have some stuff for the adults too, don't worry. But I'm so excited about this. There's going to be little art projects that you can do. You're going to have a great time. So I'd love to have you. June 1st, Art Factory. Go on our website. You have to RSVP. That way security will know who's coming. We're going to check everybody at the door because we want you to stay safe. And listen, friends, it's going to cost us $400 to do this easily, maybe even more. We don't know exactly yet, but $400, that's the base. So I need you to open your heart. I need you to think about if these things matter to you, if you want Jewish life to be abundant and joyful and all-inclusive here in Richmond, Virginia, in Midlothian, in Chesterfield, in Shockoe Bottom, in the West End, all of these different places that we go, Short Pump. If you want that, if you really want that, if that really matters to you, I hope that you'll give a donation. And I hope you'll come to our events, not just donate, because we need you. Remember, you matter.